it allows us to touch those emotions, those stories of our lives in a way which actually helps us to go deeper in them. Most professional writers go through untold number of drafts before they ever get to something that's polished. So actually just trust your voice, trust that inner you, trust your pen, and just write with that.
Have you ever wondered how writing can support your well-being? Join us on Grafto, the Power of Writing podcast, where we explore the transformative power of words. I'm your host, Alina Maragelis, and together with our amazing guests, we'll delve into the world of writing and its incredible benefits. Today we have Nigel Gibbons, who is a counselor, therapist, and a workshop facilitator using creative writing. He has particular interest in focusing the person-centered approach within the arts-based therapist and narrative approaches and research. So quite a lot of things there, Nigel. So first of all, welcome.
Thank you.
And perhaps we can start if you can tell us a bit about your background as a therapist and how come you managed to integrate creative writing into your practice.
Yeah, sure. So I'll actually go back a little bit before I was a therapist. So I've been interested in writing since I was a child. At school, I remember my secondary school English teacher telling me I'd make a very good B-movie horror writer. Because I would write these slightly shocking stories. Writing was something I did just from a personal point of view all the way through. Then when I started doing my counselling training at Bristol University here, I was doing what was called a counselling skills course, which is the introductory level, and then discovered they were also running this course called a creative writing for therapeutic purposes. And I'd done an MA in creative writing a few years earlier, and I just wanted to do it. And so did both courses at the same time. And because I was doing both courses at the same time, it meant that the reading I was doing on one, the studying I was doing on the other, just began to interact with each other. And ideas began to come together from both sides, which fed into each other. So it sort of happened quite naturally, really, that I began to integrate the writing into my counselling practice, but also I began to take my counselling skills, thoughts, everything into the writing work that I did.
Nice. And what would you say are some of the key benefits that creative writing, they do?
Yeah, so I think at one level, it touches a different part of our brain from a neurological point of view. So talking touches one part of our brain. It lights up certain of our neurons and that sort of thing. And writing does a different side. So from a counselling point of view, there can be benefits to not just the talking side of talk therapy and stuff, but also sometimes saying, actually, why don't you write about that? Because it engages somebody in a different part of their brain and that sort of thing. I think also what it allows somebody to do is to see it. The advantage of writing is it's there in front of you. It's on the page. When you're talking, it's this sort of amorphous thing that sort of is been and gone, unless you're recording it. But with writing, it's there, and we can sit and we can share it together. So from an individual point of view, there's a great benefit because this is something that we can do together, even if I'm not doing the writing. And then with a group, that sense that we could, share it with each other visually, but also, of course, the reading aloud, the repetition of something that you've written, the reading is really powerful, particularly when you're in a group, but it's also there within individuals. So those are some of the benefits for doing it. But I think also the skills that all arts therapists bring are unique. They all have a different perspective. They all have different elements to them. And I think the writing techniques, the thing that writers have done for centuries, allows us to, again, touch aspects of ourselves, whether it's writing a story or a poem or just doing mind maps or scribbles, whether you're just scribbling on the page. All of these things actually allow us to to see things in a different way, to experience them in a different way, and to express them in a different way.
And how would you say creative writing can help individuals, process emotions, cope with stress, and improve overall well-being?
Yes, I think that. So part of it is what I was just talking about there. I think the elements of part of why it connects. I mean, there's more as well there, but I think that what it does, say with stress, um, and with our problems, what I often say to clients, it's when you're holding your problems inside you, it's a bit like having a very tangled up ball of wool. There's all these bits, they're all knotted together. And actually, when you're trying to look at that, it just looks overwhelming. I mean, there's so much stuff there. How on earth can I begin to do anything with that? But when you can begin to tease a bit out, whether you're talking or whether you're writing or drawing or whatever, you begin to see it differently because actually you're seeing the single thing. And I think with writing, that advantage of teasing out slowly, you've got time to write. Even if you're writing very quickly, you're still doing it in a slower sense than when you're talking. And it allows you to see it differently. But also it then allows you to play with it and to work on it. Do I want to do this life that I live differently? Might I see it differently? If I was to write my story, my story as a fairy story, um, I could write it from different points of view. If you take something like Sleeping Beauty, you could do it from the prince's point of view or the princess's point of view or any of the other characters, or you could do it from a completely sort of top point of view, looking at all of it, sort of thing. Or you might invent something completely new to be in that story. And it can allow you to change perspective, point of view. It allows you to change genre, so you can go from different one to another. It can allow you to decide, do I want to write this with lots of dialogue, or do I want to write this descriptively? It's all those things that you can play with. And then when you get into poetry and you've got all the different poetic styles and stuff you can use if you want to, and you don't have to, but it again allows you to sort of play with the writing in a very creative, fun way, but a way that actually can be extremely insightful.
And on that, what would you say it's the difference between, let's say, free writing about our emotions and how we feel, and then the more literary creation that you were talking about, like writing poems or novels? What is the difference?
Right. It was interesting when when I first started practicing many, many years ago. I used to go to see somebody called Julie Bolton, who's been a writer in our field for a long time, and she was mentoring me. And I'd go up for a couple of hours and spend time with her in her flat, and we sort of played with different ideas and how to do things. And very often, as we were talking, she'd say to me, "Oh, why don't you write that out? Rather than talk it out." But one of the things she emphasized to me was this sense that what I've come to call raw writing, that immediate stuff that's just inside here, and I can spill it out, in seconds, and it can just go on the page. But actually, that's different from crafting that writing. When I spend time to come back to it and edit it and reflect on it and think about it deeply. And she said that, she said one of the differences is between, almost as it were, writing with your guts on the page and all the blood and the mess is there, and then tidying that up so that actually others can read it and share it in a way that's not quite so messy. And that sort of thing. And there's benefits to crafting it, there's benefits to editing things, which allow you to begin to shape whatever it is you've written. But for me, much of the writing I do is that raw end, and that's where I tend to start with most of my writing.
And how can creative writing help individuals perhaps connect with their, inner self, their, identities as well, values
Yes.
perhaps?
Yes, and I realise I didn't quite touch emotions, which you asked about earlier as well. I think it's that sense that we're so used to engaging with the world around us. If we're extroverted, introverted, whatever we are, this thing around us is something we do all the time. But for some people, there's a sense of finding access to their inner world completely easy. They just do it naturally. But for most people, actually, going into what's inside them either feels scary or disturbing or difficult and stuff like that. And what writing can do is help us to access those inner lives, those inner stories, our inner emotions in a way that we don't normally do when we're just engaging with people, when we're talking, whether it's at work or with our families or our friends or just by ourselves. We often are reflecting on things from the world around us. And taking our focus onto something that's inside us requires sometimes a very much more deliberate attention. It requires us to look at this, whatever this is, so that you might sort of think, okay, something that happened, say yesterday, had this argument, say with my partner, and yep, I know what that argument's about. But if I can pause and just reflect, I might get a sense of actually what's my feeling around this now as I think about it. Yes, I might feel I was angry at the time, but actually it's not just anger, it's a sense of an anger that's like a simmering volcano or something like that. If we can move it into sort of a deeper understanding, we can use metaphor, we can use imagery, we can use writing in different ways. It allows us to touch those emotions, those stories of our lives in a way which actually helps us to go deeper in them and to really get a better understanding of what it is for me when I'm talking about, say, my anger, as opposed to you when you're talking about, say, your anger, that actually I can express it in this particular way. Does that sort of touch what you're saying?
Yes, it does. Thank you. And if I am to expand on that, because as you mentioned, it is scary. It can be scary to go and look at ourselves or inner, to more find the solutions within us rather than in the outside world.
Yeah.
And what's the benefit? Because it is a scary process, right? So why should we do this, Nigel?
So this is where I would dip into the focusing practice you mentioned earlier on, which comes in part out of philosophy and research and stuff like that and things. But it's this idea that actually we are ongoing experiencing beings. It's as if we are living a life that's like a river. It just goes on all the time and it flows, and most of the time, for many of us, that's fine. Occasionally there might be a rock in the river or, something might have slipped in from the landslide or whatever. But every so often we come against something which seems puzzling or difficult or scary. And if we ignore it, then it's a bit like allowing that river to constantly always just go round this thing and never to address it. And actually, it might get worse. That big rock might begin to accumulate more stuff around it, or that little landslip that was on the side now becomes bigger and the river has to now go round it. So that sense of actually, if I can start paying attention to my experiencing, to what's going on for me. It doesn't have to be minutely every second of the moment, but it's that sense of what is that feeling for me now, as say I'm talking to you. If I just pause, I recognize there's a lot of excitement in me at the moment because I enjoy talking. I enjoy talking about this stuff and everything. But also there's a certain nervousness because, we're doing this live. Am I going to fall flat on my face and say something completely stupid? Well, I hope not as well. But, there is a certain little bit of me that feels nervous around this as well as excited. So it's paying attention to that ongoing flow of ourselves that actually can bring us to a deeper sense of who we are.
Thank you. And I loved your analogy. And if we're to think now a bit about the narrative therapy,
Yes.
because you mentioned a bit, okay, I want to do something with all this, right? If we are thinking first, perhaps we can tell a bit our audience what is narrative therapy, and in the creative writing space, how can we rewrite our stories as well?
Right. Okay. So the first thing I want to distinguish between something called narrative therapy, which is a particular form of therapy created by two guys out in Australia and New Zealand called White and Epstein. And they were what we call family therapists. And they were very much interested in looking at the system of the family and how the family told the story of whatever was going on in the family. And then you also have what's called narrative approaches, which can be done by people who are just researchers, got nothing to do with the therapy world, or come from a sort of a therapeutic background. And again, there's a strong parallel between the two, because it's about that sense of, how do we story our lives? How do we tell it? And, it's one of the reasons that people like over the years, popular fiction, whether it's a soap opera or a YouTube clip or an ongoing something of this or whatever it is, because it gives us a framework that actually can help us tell the story of who we are, as well as what we're listening to about the this or whatever it is like that. So that sense of what's the narrative, what's going on, and what narrative therapy encourages us to do, and narrative approaches encourage us to do, is to begin to pay attention to those stories. How do we story my life? Do I tend to see my life as a tragedy or a comedy or a romantic fiction? Do I see myself as always getting it wrong? One of the examples I give sometimes when I'm teaching is, if you imagine yourself as a driver, and let's say you might have this narrative that says, I am a dreadful driver. I can't park properly. I'm always making mistakes. I have near misses and stuff. And I draw up a little grid and I put little X's in, which are the events that the person is referring to. And you can then draw a line between those events. And that's the story they're telling. Trouble is, chances are there's an awful lot of X's that are not part of that line. There are times when they stopped at a zebra crossing and let people cross. The time when they drew up at a line and actually let the traffic pass and didn't drive straight off into the middle and go crash. The time when actually they parked their car well. There are many alternative stories that could be told. And too often in our lives, from a narrative therapy point of view, we tell thin stories about ourselves. We tell stories which are very limited. And what narrative approach is, one of the things it encourages us to do is to thicken that story. How do we broaden it and make it much more richer? Because actually then we can begin to be more authentic to ourselves.
And what are some of the reasons we do this? Because I think there is some comfort there, right? It means if I'm a terrible driver, I don't have to drive much, right?
Yep.
So how do we go around this? Because that needs to be addressed as well. We
Yep.
tell ourselves these perhaps teen stories because they do, in a way, make us feel, safe, or we don't have to do something different, right?
Yeah,
So
and
how
exactly.
do we address that?
Exactly. You don't have to do something different. You might thicken the story. You might realize actually I'm a pretty competent driver. Actually, I don't kill people most of the time.
Yeah.
I don't crash my car most of the time. But it doesn't mean I necessarily want to drive as much as I possibly can. You have a choice. You can thicken the story, you can enrich it, but then you might need to decide, actually, do I want to do that more? Or actually, for all very good reasons, you might think, actually, I want to preserve the environment a bit more and just walk a lot more, or keep myself fit. There may be other reasons that you might not choose to enact that thickened story.
And then why do we create these stories? Are they coming from our, perhaps, you were talking about families and how we were brought up. How do we get to have these stories, right? Which are very fixed and in a way limiting us and what we can do, our capabilities.
Yeah, and I think it's part of what makes us human beings. I think human beings have told stories for millennia, almost certainly. The story about that shadow in the jungle that turned out to be the tiger, and actually I was right to run away from it. Or that scent on the wind, which actually turned out to be my best friend who was sort of coming to help me on the hunt. And I was wrong to be scared. Whatever it is, we would have sat round and told stories about the hunt or the family or how to bring up the kids or whatever it is. And I think that very often growing up in groups, we tell stories without realizing that's what we're doing. one of the stories about me when I was a child, I was a really screaming baby. I mean, I was very hungry all the I was very hungry all the time. And eventually, my mum, this is back in the 50s, was bottle feeding me. Eventually, the midwife said, give him 2 bottles. And I became known in the family stories as the 2-bottle baby. And there was this ongoing thing that Nigel always wants more. And so when I was a teenager, and if I'd go away on a camp or something, I was always the one who would go around and finish off everybody else's food at the end of it. So there's this sort of narrative that was told about me, but also I integrated into my own life in a practical way as well. And it was, overconsume.
Okay. And if we are to think now a bit about some of the benefits, let's say, so and I will choose something perhaps negative that we tell to ourselves, because that is in a way limiting us.
Yeah.
If we start to write, what are some of the benefits so that we can open those possibilities and see ourselves differently, perhaps?
Yeah. So if we well, I'll try and go from a real example. If we think I've got my life completely wrong, I was with a partner, and I left them, and after I left them, and this is a very real sad story, they died. And actually, if I'd been with them, maybe they wouldn't have died. So I begin to feel guilty and that sort of thing. And what I did with this particular client was I encouraged them to do what's called expressive writing or flow writing. And it's based on a particular approach. But over the week between seeing him and everything, he wrote for 4 different occasions about this experience. And initially, the writing was feeling very guilty. And it felt, I should have, I should have done something about this. I should have been there. She actually chose to leave him. It wasn't anything to do with him. But gradually over the writing, it began to shift and it began to get a different perspective. What was interesting, though, was he came in to talk to me and he shared some of this writing and I could see the difference in it. He couldn't at that point, and I was reflecting it back to him. And then he went away, and we were going to see each other the following week. And he said, as he was driving away, he was on a dual carriageway, and he just burst into tears. And he had to pull over into a lay-by and just cry because he suddenly realized it wasn't his fault. He wasn't responsible. He wasn't guilty in that sense. And he came back the following week and he was transformed. He was just so different. And part of it was the act of the doing the writing, just the talking about it for him wasn't enough. Writing it out in that way, sharing it with me, but then reflecting on it internally. I don't think he was thinking about it when he was driving, but his brain was turning it over. And then he got that moment. So I think that part of what this can do for us is it can give us a sense of insight. It can give us a sense of seeing things differently, but also what I call the process of just doing it, the actual physical process of writing and reading it out and sharing in and of itself is beneficial. Even if you don't necessarily need to try and think, I'm looking for an insight here, in terms of what I've written. All these things can be really helpful.
And thank you for that specific example, Nigel. So, and what do we do with situations where we could have done it better and we know? What do we do with those? How do we rewrite those? Because I'm assuming there is a lot of guilt and perhaps even shame when we do things that we're, let's say, not proud, right?
Yeah.
So how can we rewrite those? How can we give ourselves, understanding or compassion?
Yeah, absolutely.
So that, we do, we don't get so much stuck in that scenario, but more, what can we do? How can we grow and behave differently?
And I think that in part it's being very gentle with ourselves and actually accepting that actually this is how I'm feeling at the moment. I'm feeling guilty. I did this and I really shouldn't have done it. And actually this has now resulted. But the act of writing something there repeatedly, coming back to it, coming from different angles, writing it in different ways, what it can begin to do is to open something up in us that begins to accept that yeah, I did mess up there. I didn't get it right. Um, but actually, I'm a human being. We all mess up. We all get things wrong at different points. And actually, I can begin to see as I write the story and it's there in front of me, I can feel a little bit perhaps of compassion for that person who's written that thing. I can feel a bit of acceptance that actually it's okay. They got it wrong, but they're not perfect. No, but none of us are. And it's in the situation you're talking about there, it's a process. It's about going through things slowly and not trying to rush it and expect to think I'm going to write something in 5 minutes and everything's going to be fine, because exactly it won't be at all. But you keep coming back to it, and this is on a different level. The situation in our world at the moment, I won't refer to anybody in particular, but there's certain things that are going on in the world that I find really quite difficult. I've had a practice now since very early in the pandemic of writing something every morning. I have a little A5 notebook. I write a bit of A5 every day. And it allows me to reflect on these situations and to express the fact that I feel angry and grumpy and about it and stuff. But actually, then I can begin to smile at myself and actually notice that. I can begin to be playful with it and notice there are some good things there as well. Equally, but not to run away. I was watching the news last night and some of the images from Gaza, absolutely horrific images and stuff. This isn't about trying to make something up and pretend the world is beautiful when actually there's real problems and there's real pain and there's real hurt, both in our lives and in other people's lives. But if we can begin to reflect on it and capture it and begin to accept who I am in what I can do and how I can be in these situations, and then accept the variety of emotions and feelings that I have about them and not try to push them away and say, oh, you shouldn't think like that. But just say, actually, this is how I'm feeling. It can begin to help us move forward.
Yeah. And know ourselves as well, right? Because unless we do specific things, then we can't grow, because we can't go through that, painful sometimes process that you're talking about. So it's part of our growth.
Exactly. If you go back to that river illustration, if we just simply accept, if we accept there's a rock there, that's great. But if we accept it and then to try and hide away from it and don't do anything, it actually will accumulate and get bigger, and then it will get a real problem for us.
Correct. Yes. And how, if we're thinking now about our fear of judgment, or the belief we're not creative enough
yes,
to engage in creative writing, how can we overcome that fear?
Yeah, I think that's something I recognize both in myself and in people I work with and stuff. And one of the things very early on when I started doing this, I wrote a set of guidelines as to how to work. And part of it was that sense of accepting there will always be somebody out there who writes better than you do. You can't sit in a group and think I'm the best writer here, because that's just unrealistic unless you're astonishing. But equally, they're all exactly, and it could be the next group or the next group. But it's always that sense of there's always somebody better. That sense of what I'm trying to encourage people to do is to get in touch, let's say, with this raw writing, this immediate writing that's there. Actually, that's going to be vulnerable and it's going to be messy and it's not going to be perfect writing. And it's going to be bleh when it comes out on the page. And actually, that's valuable, because then I can see what that bleh is like and where it's feeling and stuff. So it is that sense that actually we want to be kind with ourselves, gentle with ourselves, accepting of ourselves as we are at this point in our writing. And if you want to work on your writing, that's absolutely fine. But it's just to say, in this moment, this is how I write. So just a very quick example, when I'm running a writing group and I set a writing exercise, I'll often do the writing as well. But I set the exercise, say it's 5 minutes, they start writing, I'm watching everybody make sure it's okay. Then I start writing, so I've already lost a minute. And then I'm stopping early to make sure that I can then bring it to a close. So I may get 3 minutes to write when they've all had 5 minutes. And I'm very happy to write crap and then to share that out, because in 3 minutes, it could come out wonderful. It could come out usually very ordinary. Occasionally it'll come out absolute crap. but that's what's come out of my pen at that moment. So I'm happy to share that.
Yeah. And for beginners on that, what would be the easiest way to get started, with creative writing? What would be some, I don't know, exercises?
I mean, I think the things I tend to use when I'm working with a writing group for the first time is first of all, just to pause and just think, how am I feeling at the moment? Just write a word down, just one word. Because actually the blank page is the worst thing in writing. Put something down on it. And if you got a word down, you might then try and extend that, make it into a few words, make it into a picture or a sound or something else, develop it a little bit further. There's something called free writing, which is where you're encouraged to write without worrying about spelling or grammar or punctuation or even making sense. Just simply write whatever's down the end of your pen. Give yourself 5 minutes, 6 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever it is, and just write in that sort of way. I think also finding short exercises. So there's something called a STEM exercise where you start writing I want, and then you just write I want over and over and over again. And actually you find quite quickly it will generate some thoughts for you. And that can be quite helpful when you're dealing with issues in your life. What is it I want in this situation? You might say I want. And I think also that sense of finding something that really engages you, whether it's a bit of poetry somebody else is writing, whether it's a view out the window, leaves bouncing, birds singing. Try to find something that touches you in here and use that as a starting point, just to start with the writing. As I'm watching this bird dancing on the roofs, I feel this, and then just see where your pen goes.
Very beautifully said. And our last question, Nigel, what would you, so if we're thinking in terms of focus or the process of writing, right?
Yes.
When I'm writing a poem or I'm thinking I want to create a literary creation, or I want to write about my feelings, what are the differences between the two from a well-being perspective? Are they both, therapeutical, and how? And how can I almost like box it, right? Now I'm going to write for creation. Now I'm going to write about my emotions. Or what's the difference? Or, what's in terms of my focus and also the outcome?
Yeah. So I think in terms of looking at it from a sort of a theoretical perspective, to me, there's a spectrum here. You can do things that are very deeply therapy, and you're really trying to explore things, and then you're looking at things that are around about well-being. It's about making us feel better. Then you've got things that are just fun. You write something that's playful, and then you move down the spectrum and you move to the craft of writing. The practice of crafting and something like that. So I think there's that, but also I think that how do I do it? Don't think beforehand, I'm going to write something that's to be polished. Don't think I'm just going to do this. Just write what comes out the end of your pen and then see what you've got once you've written it. Most professional writers go through untold number of drafts before they ever get to something that's polished. So actually just trust your voice, trust that inner you, trust your pen, and just write with that. And
probably create masterpieces, right?
Who knows? I've never yet done that.
Well, time is still there, and I haven't either, Nigel, but I'm still hopeful.
Good. Okay. Oh, so am I.
Not, I'll rewrite that story for me.
Exactly.
I will challenge those limiting beliefs so that I think I can create that.
Yeah, completely.
So thank you so much, Nigel, for our rich conversation today, and for your metaphors and examples. I think they were very useful and interesting for our audience to get a bit of an understanding of what creative writing is and how it can help us rewrite our stories or express our emotions or create masterpieces.
Yep, completely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful day.
And goodbye to everybody. Take care. Bye then.